everyone, and welcome to the session today. Today we are going to be talking about some of the benefits of creating a sense of belonging for our students and faculty, particularly in the higher education space. I am Katie Kapler. I am the co-founder and CEO of Inscribe, and we are a virtual community platform that helps institutions connect students with their peers, with staff and faculty on campus, so they can easily access the information and the individuals that they need to be successful. And I'm really excited today. I'm joined by Dr. Omid Fatui, who is currently the Director of Learning Innovation at WGU Labs. Dr. Fatui is a social psychologist with a research focus on motivation and optimal performance. He earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. Dr. Fatui also holds an affiliation with the University of Pittsburgh, as well as being the Director of Learning Innovation at WGU Labs. With a deep understanding of psychological theory and research methodology, Dr. Fatui has devoted his career to translating key insights from research on performance optimization and turning them into actionable strategies to help improve critical outcomes in the domains of academics, athletics, leadership, and personal growth. So we are in great hands today. Welcome, Omid.
Hi, Katie. Good to be here.
Awesome. So just to give you some context, our attendees some context for how things are going to work today. Really, this is just going to be a conversation between Dr. Fatui and myself. And we also are really interested in understanding a little bit about our audience and what brought you here today. So if you could just let us know kind of who you are and what brought you here by adding your notes in the chat for this slide. You can respond directly to the prompt that we've added there. It'd be great to just get to know you a little bit as we go. So let's get started. I think just to kind of set the stage, it would be good to talk a little bit about, what do we actually mean by a sense of belonging and why do we care? Why is it really so important today?
That's a great question. And especially when you think about education, it seems like not a completely obvious answer either, because if it's assumed that learning and education is about content mastery, why are we talking about an experience of belonging? Why does that matter? Well, one thing that's important to note from psychology is that there are these dimensions that we call needs that differ slightly than what we might refer to as desires or aspirations. And why that distinction is important is because when we talk about core fundamental needs, we have to recognize that unless those needs are fulfilled, that we can't function in any domain. And so when we're talking about a domain of importance, a domain of relevance, we have to make sure that those core needs are first met before we can expect any of the higher order experiences to work well. And when we think about learning in that context, actually, one of the things I try to be a proponent of is to recognize that learning from its early rudimentary forms has always been a social experience. It's not this content mastery process where you're exposed to some information, you're expected to memorize it and then to replicate it on a test. There's a lot more happening there than meets the eye. And essentially what happens as we develop from early ages is we navigate these different dimensions of performance or different dimensions of importance, all the while experimenting with trying to figure out, is this a place that I can identify with? Is this a place where I belong? And we rely on the cues, both internal as well as external, to help us make that inference. If you look at a child who's learning how to walk, they don't know how to walk, and yet they somehow muster the courage to start trying. That probably has to do with the fact that they look around, they see everybody else is walking, so it's a pretty well-represented behavior. They also have no past history or experience of sort of a learned helplessness that comes from repeated failure. So they have no reason to think that it's not worth trying to learn how to walk. Now, I'll also propose that there's an additional component that when it comes to the parents who are encouraging those children on how to take their first steps, that also in their minds, there's no notion of possible failure for their children, that no parent is going to say, you know what, we've given this whole walking thing a try for a couple of years, clearly they're not getting it, so let's move on. There's no option of failure. And why those things are important is because as we think about belonging, much of it can be summarized as a desire for perceived positive regard, where we feel valued, accepted, and respected in a domain. And as we navigate through these different areas of learning, we're always asking ourselves, is this a place where I feel like I can belong, where I feel valued and accepted and respected? And if the answer is no, then the likely outcome is that we disengage from that domain because it's a threat. It's not something that we think we can excel at or come to identify with. So that's why it's important to think about belonging as we think about learning.
Terrific. And did we talk through these three kinds of belonging issues?
No, but I think it's important to highlight when we are talking about belonging issues, especially in the learning context, it's also important to distinguish between the three common issues that come up so that we can focus on the one particular issue that is of most relevance that can be targeted. So if you think of it, there's really three possible ways in which belonging can be a concern for someone or an issue for someone. The first instance is if you are placed in a new context and you're very overtly and explicitly and clearly shown through discrimination or exclusion that you don't belong. That can obviously not be a great thing. And again, the resulting consequence is that you disengage from that domain because you know that that's not a place for you. The second kind of belonging issue has to do with when you arrive in a new context and for whatever reason you don't want to belong in that context. So for you, you think that the value added doesn't align with your own priorities and your own goals. And the third one, which is where we'll sort of focus on the most, is when you are placed in a new context and you're having to make sense of the ambiguous cues in that context and constantly trying to decide whether you do or you don't belong. And why I argue this is probably the most important specific version of the belonging issue is because with the other two experiences of belonging, there's at least clarity about whether you do or don't belong, or about whether you want to or don't want to belong. So if you know that you don't belong, at least you have that message, that clarity from a very early stage, allowing you to disengage and move on to a different domain. The second, if you know that you don't want to belong, again, you can say that this is not for me and move on to other avenues of opportunities for yourself. But if you're placed in a situation where you're constantly having to navigate the ambiguities about whether you do or you don't belong, you're sort of locked into this murky domain of ambiguity, all the while trying to figure out if you do or don't belong. And that uncertainty becomes the root cause of why we see students feel so taxed, feel so stressed, because they're constantly trying to navigate these ambiguities about whether they do or don't belong. And I'll mention one other thing which is important, is that the college experience, the learning experience, is filled with ambiguities. You have a larger classroom and you go to speak with your professor at the end of the class, and the professor is not as warm or responsive to you as maybe your high school teacher was. Now, that's an ambiguous interaction. You don't get invited to a party where your floor mates have been invited to. That's an ambiguous situation. And in those moments of ambiguity is where you have to make sense and decipher what it means about you in that context. Now, the other thing that's important to note is that for certain groups where they don't have the past exemplars or they're contending with negative stereotypes about their groups, absent any other information in those moments of ambiguity, they have to rely on the available information, which unfortunately can be the negative stereotypes about them or their group. And as you can probably infer where I'm going with this is that these belonging issues disproportionately impact those groups who are underrepresented and potentially marginalized.
Right. Yes, and you could totally see that, and probably amplified by the fact that, you're also out of the context of where you were, where you may have felt safe at home with your family, with your friends that you grew up with. So you're managing all of this uncertainty and challenge also without any of those structures that you probably relied on previously.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
So lots of, very clear why and how sense of belonging really manifests itself as an important consideration in the education landscape. Um, what are some of the things that get in the way or impact a student's sense of belonging?
Yeah, and we've touched on one of them already, but I like to think about these domains of barriers, of obstacles, as falling into one of two broad categories. Those that are sort of internally driven. So as you can see from this image, there's sort of a blurriness to the image that without a corrective lens, it's hard to decipher exactly what you're looking at. And that represents the set of attributions or expectations that we bring into a new context um, in trying to navigate what the ambiguities in that context mean. So as I referred to earlier, if you're part of a negatively stigmatized or a stereotyped group and you're put in a context where necessarily you're going to be expected to endure difficult content mastery and navigate new social dynamics, that difficulty or that ambiguity might now be informed by the negative stereotypes that loom large in the air. So if you have that bad grade in the math class, you might rely on the negative stereotypes that maybe you or your students from your group can't cut it in college, where in fact that may not necessarily be true, but because there's no other evidence to the contrary, that's all you have to go by. And so those internally driven psychological attributional patterns that we have that help us make sense of the world shape our our interpretations of what the situation means for us. So that's the one broad category, and there's a range of specific psychological factors. But there's also the second broad category, which I think is important to highlight, which is that it may not just be the lens through which you're looking at the world. They may actually be the cues that you're interacting with.
Mm.
So we mentioned certain contexts where belonging is clearly not something that's extended to you or your group, that there is overt discrimination, overt exclusion. And so messages in the environment could signal to you that this isn't a place for you. Now, they can be clear, as I mentioned, but they can also be subtle. You can have that ambiguous interaction with a professor. Now you have to make sense of what that means. You could be looking around and see that there's dramatic underrepresentation of people of your group. And you might wonder, why is it that I'm one of 50 people from my group in this class? You might have to walk down, if you're a female in a STEM field, the corridors of a traditionally male institution to get to the bathroom. And as you're walking down these corridors, you see picture after picture of old white guy after coming out of a class with, again, you being one of the very few individual students of your gender, and you just got a bad grade. Again, you're left to decipher what do these cues mean about me in this place. The other, I think, potential cue that we're now faced with in light of COVID is the structural barriers that we're having to navigate. If we don't have access to proper Wi-Fi or a computer that can adequately process streaming learning experience, what does that mean about me in terms of whether I should be here and part of this learning experience? So there are these two broad categories, and the reason why it's important to think about them as distinct is because when you're trying to come up with solutions, you can actually target them independently as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the takeaways too is uh, as an institution you have to be probably intentional about your strategies in both of those contexts, right? And just addressing one without the other, you're not going to get all the way there. So really being thoughtful about how you go after both internal and external solutions for your students.
That's a great point, Katie. Absolutely.
And to that end, we would love to know from the audience, what have you seen at your institution in terms of things you've done to build community and help establish belonging? Have you faced challenges, especially today with COVID? Has that changed your approach and added additional challenges for you? So just love to hear from you. Again, you can respond directly to the question that we have posted in the comments, and we look forward to hearing your feedback on that. So kind of continuing the conversation, and we've, COVID has come up a couple of times here. So the experience is different, I think, depending on the institution that we're in, but by and large, many of us, our students, are not getting to spend the in-person time that they're used to, either with their peers or with their faculty or anyone else. Are there specific things that we can do to make up for this? And to touch on that sense of bringing people together and building community.
Yeah, I appreciate that COVID has had a pretty significant disruption to the way that we think about learning and education. But I think what it's also afforded us is an opportunity to try to understand the critical factors that leverage more effective learning. So the fact that traditional educational institutions haven't already been replaced by MOOCs is a question that many philosophers have thought about. But now that we've had a disruption, we can more critically think about, well, what is it that those experiences offered? And when it comes to learning, as I mentioned earlier, learning really is the social experience where you are able to experiment and potentially internalize and accept new identities in domains that matter. And where that plays into the fact that it's important to have these classroom contexts is because that's where these almost non-intentional but really important interactions occur. These spontaneous, organic interactions that we have with our peers sitting in a class. We have a conversation, they ask us questions. We end up working with them in teams, and those help to foster that identity that, yes, maybe this is a place for me. We might interact with a professor who asks us a question because they care about what we think. And again, that seems to foster the notion that maybe this is a place for us because we're getting all this positive signaling from the context that suggests this is indeed a place for you, despite the fact that what you're learning is difficult and hard. So as we think about those factors, I would say there are a few key qualities or characteristics that we can identify as being core to what we can make up for in the loss of the in-person interactions. One of which, as I mentioned, is these low stakes, spontaneous kinds of interactions that people can engage in, because that's where the identity formation occurs. And then the second is really being able to have social capital where you're able to demonstrate value in a particular area of growth to others, which again is reinforced by these non-formal forms of interactions.
Mm-hmm.
I cut you off, Katie. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was going to reflect on it, certainly in our own work at Inscribe. We've always worked a lot with online students, and that landscape is much broader now. And it's some of the tools that we see people use in the communities that they build among their students are things like, making sure space is set aside for, as you said, just very low stakes types of conversations and communication, and drawing in the stories of faculty and staff and other students to, just sort of humanize themselves, even if they're at a distance. And I think students really appreciate hearing those stories and just being able to interact with them in a way that, they're not being graded for it, they're not being required to do it. It's just an easy, low stakes way to get engaged and feel connected.
I just want to add one more thing to that, which is that I think traditionally we do tend to have almost too narrow a focus on the students. But at the same time, and in the same fashion, the faculty and the staff also get that sense of identification with their jobs, with their roles, through these organic interactions with students. When a student shows that they appreciate what the faculty or the staff member is doing, when they come to them with questions, that conveys to the faculty that they are adding some value to the students' lives. So again, there has been a significant disruption or loss to those opportunities for both groups to be able to draw value from their interaction with each other. But recognizing that, I think the effort will come in trying to replicate the channels that allows for more of those low stakes, spontaneous, organic conversations and interactions that fuels those identities.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Don't forget about the faculty and the staff, right? With all of this that's going on, they're also feeling a lot of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
So I think just kind of to round out, I'd love to hear people are thinking about building, they're thinking about belonging, they understand the role that community can have in helping students, faculty, and staff. What are some considerations that people should think about as they embark on maybe some of this work?
Yeah. I think one thing I'll mention is from a broad perspective or broad level, learning really, again, is a social experience. And at the end of the day, what we care about is to feel like we have that positive regard. And that means creating cultures of caring, right? Creating cultures of support for every student in every way. But what I can also add to that is that drawing from social psychology, there are a few, I think, critical strategies that might help to enhance whatever channel you're creating. And those basically consist of a recognition that timing is critical. As we've sort of laid the foundation for this conversation in saying that it's the uncertainty of belonging that really impacts students, it's also important to recognize that those uncertainties are greatest during initial transitions into new contexts. That's when we have the greatest questions about whether this is indeed somewhere that I belong. Can I do this? And so being able to identify those early moments when students might ask these questions of belonging can also inform how and when you choose to intervene or reach out and target those student populations. The timing is critical, and typically earlier is better, but also in combination with recognized moments of high stress. So right now, I think when this airs, I think there's sort of a national experience of high stress. As people transition into college for the first time, that's a pretty volatile moment. As they transition to their second semester, also a critical moment. So thinking about those firsts as really critical touch points that you can intervene on. The other is recognizing in that as we're navigating these challenges and difficulties, that the question we're constantly trying to fend off is that maybe it's something about me that's fixed and permanent that is the reason why I'm feeling this way. It's the reason why I doubt whether I do or don't belong. And so how we sort of target that is create experiences that allows for normalization of those experiences, where students realize that actually what I'm going through, I can see other individuals going through as well.
Yeah.
In this sort of non-formal opportunity, are able to recognize that essentially we're all pretty similar. And the things that we go through have more to do with the fact that these are the qualities of the transition, so that college is difficult and getting to know a new structure, a new organization, a new campus is uncertain, and not have anything to do with us. So the fact that I don't know how to register for classes doesn't mean that I'm inadequate. It just means that this is a new process. So normalizing those experiences is critical in helping students navigate the uncertainty and then eventually be able to identify as a person who says, okay, I can do this. And then the third is, which is something I've learned with my children, in that it turns out that the best way to get them not to do something, or anyone not to do something, is to tell them what to do and why they should do it. We unfortunately don't respond as well to advice or strategies or input or information as well as when it comes internally.
Right.
So rather than have someone tell us that, yes, you should belong, and yes, these things will be hard, you're able to create the experiences where people are able to self-generate or self-author those insights, then that's the most powerful. And essentially, that's what we can strive to do, is to create the opportunities where students can really come to these insights for themselves. And I would say that's probably the third key strategy from psychology that we can leverage to enhance the work that we're already doing.
Yeah, and I think that's partly why also these virtual community spaces can be so powerful, because they really are, if they're designed properly, student initiated, student driven, student owned, and nobody's requiring that you go in there and do anything. And so just by seeing the questions that other students are asking, see the experiences that other students are sharing, you get both the benefits of sort of the normalization. Oh, I'm not the only one that doesn't understand what was going on in that math test, for example. But it also is totally driven by the student themselves. And so I think it accomplishes a lot of these goals in a nice sort of seamless way.
Yeah, and I think to that point also, Katie, which is a really great, I think, understanding of how these channels have evolved and can continue to evolve.
Mhm.
But sometimes people question whether they're having the scale that they ought to have, because not everybody may be using every channel all at the same time.
Right.
And I think the argument against that criticism is that creating the opportunities and the channels for people to be able to engage in these kinds of experiences is actually more of a tailored intervention, or a tailored opportunity, because those who end up needing those channels sort of self-select to using these channels more often. And so
Right.
just because you don't have an entire student population leveraging these channels does not mean that you failed. And I
Right.
think one of the recommendations is to recognize that you may need to create different channels for different groups of students based on their different needs. But that
Yep.
ultimately, those who do engage and stay engaged are there because they're deriving some core need that's being fulfilled.
Right. Exactly. That's a great point. Great point. Um, so for those folks who are thinking about this now and sort of thinking about how this is working at their own institution, I did want to let you know that we have worked with Omid and some others to develop a institutional self-assessment that you can use to just kind of think through how community and belonging are working at your institution for both your students and your faculty. So again, you can just, there's a link to that assessment in the notes section. And we suggest that you take that, and it's just a great self-reflection tool to kind of learn about, what's going on. It's also a nice tool to use, have several colleagues fill it out, and then you guys can kind of compare notes and see where there might be some opportunities at your institution to connect with students a little bit better. And with that, if you have any additional comments or questions, please do put them in the chat. We will be bouncing in and out to respond to those as they come in. And with that, I want to thank Omid for joining me today. It was great to hear your perspective on this. If people would like any more information about Inscribe, again, you can find a link to our website in the chat area. And we look forward to hearing all the comments that you've put in the session today. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you,
Omid.
everyone. Thank you. Always a pleasure.